What were the African-American recipes that helped us survive the Civil Rights era? These recipes kept families fed, stretched every dollar, and brought people together in the face of hardship. When survival tasted like this, how could those flavors ever fade? Cowpea stew with okra was more than a filling dinner. It was a direct link to West African cooking traditions that had crossed the ocean and endured through generations. In the kitchens of the Civil Rights era, this dish was a reminder of heritage and a way to feed many with what was available. Dried cowpeas, often bought in bulk for a low price, would be soaked and then simmered with okra until everything melded into a thick, hearty pot. Seasonings were simple but bold: garlic, onions, and a pinch of red pepper for heat. Some cooks added a ham hock or a bit of salt pork when they could, but even without meat, it was rich in flavor. The okra thickened the broth naturally, creating a stew that clung to cornbread or rice. It was the kind of meal that could be reheated for days, stretching every bit of food and labor. Around the table, families shared not just sustenance, but the comfort of knowing they were continuing something older than struggle itself. It was the taste of endurance, a dish that spoke softly of survival while feeding the body enough to face another day of work and fight. Cracklin cornbread was the kind of dish that brought a smile even in the hardest of times. It was regular cornbread, but elevated with bits of crispy rendered pork skin baked right in, giving every bite a savory crunch and deep smoky flavor. During the Civil Rights era, pork was a staple protein because every part of the animal could be used, and nothing was wasted. Cracklins were often leftovers from rendering lard, meaning they cost little to nothing for families who already had to stretch every meal. The cornbread batter itself was made with cornmeal, a bit of flour, eggs if they were on hand, and buttermilk or sour milk for tang. Once baked, it was golden on the outside and tender inside, dotted with pockets of salty cracklin pieces. Served alongside greens, beans, or stew, it transformed simple fare into something hearty and satisfying. For many, this bread was more than a side dish. It was the centerpiece of the meal, filling bellies and bringing people together. The smell of it baking was enough to draw neighbors to the kitchen, where conversations about justice, change, and hope might mingle with talk of recipes. Cracklin cornbread was proof that flavor could thrive even in lean times. Stewed pig ears were a dish that turned thrift into tenderness. In the Civil Rights era, communities knew the value of making use of every part of the animal, and pig ears were no exception. They were tough at first, but with slow simmering, they transformed into something soft and rich. Cooks would first clean the ears thoroughly, then place them in a pot with onions, garlic, bay leaves, vinegar, and seasonings like black pepper or crushed red pepper flakes. The vinegar helped tenderize the meat and added brightness to balance its richness. Sometimes a ham bone or smoked turkey neck was added for deeper flavor. Once cooked for hours, the ears developed a gelatinous texture that clung to the seasoned broth. Served over rice, they made a filling meal that felt indulgent despite its humble origins. For many families, stewed pig ears were not just about resourcefulness, but about honoring a tradition of eating nose to tail, passed down from African and rural Southern roots. In kitchens filled with the sound of laughter and the aroma of slow-cooked pork, pig ears carried the quiet pride of making something nourishing from what others might overlook. Turnip green soup was the embodiment of making the most of what the garden offered. In the Civil Rights era, fresh produce often came from backyard gardens or community plots, and turnip greens were prized for their hardiness and nutrition. This soup began with a pot of simmering water or broth, to which chopped greens were added along with onions, garlic, and sometimes diced turnips for extra body. A ham hock or small piece of salt pork, if available, would be added for smoky depth, but the soup could also be kept entirely vegetable-based when meat was scarce. The greens broke down into a flavorful broth that was both hearty and comforting, perfect for spooning over cornbread or serving alongside rice. It was a dish that could be kept warm on the stove all day, feeding anyone who stopped by. In homes where every scrap of food mattered, turnip green soup was a way to turn a humble harvest into a communal meal. Its warmth nourished not just the body, but the spirit, reminding everyone at the table of the power of simple shared sustenance in uncertain times. Sorghum molasses. Cookies were a sweet that tasted like home even when times were hard. Sorghum syrup, thick and deep brown, was cheaper than refined sugar and had been used for generations in African American kitchens. During the Civil Rights era, it was a pantry staple that stretched far, sweetening biscuits, bread, and especially cookies. The dough was made with flour, baking soda, warm spices like cinnamon and ginger, a bit of fat such as lard or shortening, and enough sorghum to give it a rich, earthy sweetness. Once baked, the cookies came out soft and chewy, with a subtle spice that lingered on the tongue. They were easy to make in big batches, perfect for church gatherings, neighborhood meetings, or simply to have on hand for children after school. Sorghum cookies traveled well too, tucked into lunch pails or wrapped in wax paper for marches and long days away from home. They were a taste of comfort in moments that often carried uncertainty and struggle. More than a treat, they were a reminder that joy could be baked into even the leanest kitchens, and that a little sweetness could go a long way in sustaining both body and spirit. Chicken gizzard stew was a dish born of patience and ingenuity. Gizzards, the tough, muscular part of a chicken's digestive system, were inexpensive and often overlooked by those who could afford pricier cuts. But in African American kitchens during the Civil Rights era, they were transformed into something hearty and deeply flavorful. First, the gizzards were cleaned and simmered slowly in a pot with onions, celery, and carrots until they began to turn tender. A roux or flour slurry was sometimes added to thicken the broth into a rich gravy, and seasonings like garlic powder, thyme, and black pepper gave it depth. Some cooks added potatoes to make the meal stretch even further. The slow cooking not only softened the gizzards, but also infused the broth with a savory richness that was perfect for spooning over rice or soaking up with cornbread. This was a dish that filled the home with the smell of slow-simmered comfort, the kind that made neighbors stop by for just a taste. In times when every dollar had to stretch, chicken gizzard stew proved that the humblest ingredients could still bring people together around the table. Sweet rice pudding with raisins was the kind of dessert that turned scraps into something special. Leftover rice from supper would be mixed with milk, a bit of sugar or sorghum, and a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg. Raisins, when they could be afforded, were stirred in to plump up during baking, adding little bursts of sweetness in each bite. Some families used evaporated milk to make it creamier, while others relied on whatever dairy was on hand. The mixture was poured into a baking dish and cooked slowly until the top formed a gentle crust, while the inside stayed soft and custard-like. Served warm or cold, it was a treat that stretched simple pantry staples into something comforting enough to end a long day. During the Civil Rights era, it was common for rice pudding to be brought to church socials or community gatherings, where recipes were shared and adapted. For many, it carried memories of grandmothers standing over the stove, stirring patiently while telling stories of resilience. Sweet rice pudding was more than a way to use leftovers. It was proof that thrift and care could create something that fed both hunger and the soul. Black-eyed pea fritters were a crispy, golden reminder of African culinary heritage. Known in West Africa as okra, they made their way into African American kitchens through generations of passed-down cooking. Dried black-eyed peas were soaked, peeled, and ground into a thick paste, then seasoned with salt, onion, and sometimes hot pepper. Small spoonfuls of the mixture were dropped into hot oil and fried until puffed and browned. The outside had a satisfying crunch while the inside stayed tender and savory. They could be eaten alone with a hot sauce drizzle or alongside greens and cornbread. During the Civil Rights era, they were an affordable way to feed many mouths quickly, especially at gatherings before or after community meetings. Black-eyed pea fritters traveled well, making them a practical snack to carry during long days of organizing and protesting. Beyond their affordability, they carried the taste of history, a direct link back to African foodways that had survived slavery and segregation. In a time when cultural pride was a quiet act of resistance, frying up a batch of black-eyed pea fritters was both sustenance and a way to keep tradition alive. Pickled okra pods were a bright, tangy counterpoint to heavier meals, bringing both crunch and flavor to the table. Fresh okra was packed into jars with vinegar, garlic, dill, and often a pinch of red pepper flakes for heat. The jars were sealed and left to sit, allowing the brine to work its magic. The pickling not only preserved the okra, but also made it a refreshing side dish that could be enjoyed long after the growing season had ended. During the Civil Rights era, when store-bought pickles could be a luxury, home-pickled vegetables were a staple in many African American households. Pickled okra was eaten straight from the jar as a snack, chopped into salads, or served alongside fried fish and cornbread. The process was a way to make the most of a garden's bounty, ensuring that nothing went to waste. It was also a communal task, with families often gathering to pickle together, swapping jars and recipes. In a time of uncertainty, a jar of pickled okra in the pantry meant a burst of brightness was always within reach, adding both flavor and a small reminder of self-reliance. Molasses glazed carrots were a dish that made the most of a humble garden harvest. Carrots were peeled, sliced, and simmered until just tender, then tossed in a glossy glaze made from molasses, butter, and a touch of salt. The molasses gave the dish a deep, slightly smoky sweetness that was far richer than plain sugar. It was an inexpensive way to dress up a common vegetable, turning it into something worthy of a Sunday dinner table. During the Civil Rights era, this recipe was especially valued because it could be prepared from ingredients already in the pantry and garden. Molasses was a cheaper sweetener than refined sugar and lasted a long time on the shelf. Carrots, grown in backyard plots or received from neighbors, were available for much of the year. The dish was often paired with roasted meats or stews, its sweetness balancing savory flavors. Families would sometimes make extra, knowing it would reheat well for another meal. In kitchens where nothing was wasted, molasses glazed carrots showed that care in seasoning and presentation could elevate even the simplest produce into something memorable. Stewed tomatoes with rice and bacon was a dish that turned a simple garden harvest into a filling, smoky sweet meal. Fresh tomatoes were peeled and cooked down slowly until they formed a rich, chunky sauce. Strips of bacon, fried until crisp, added both salt and depth, with the rendered fat giving the tomatoes a savory richness. The mixture was poured generously over hot rice, making it a one-bowl supper that stretched ingredients without sacrificing flavor. During the Civil Rights era, this dish was common in households that relied on home gardens and preserved meats. The balance of acidic tomatoes, salty bacon, and soft rice created a satisfying contrast, making it equally suited for a weekday meal or a Sunday table. Often, cooks would adjust the seasoning with a pinch of sugar to mellow the tomatoes' tang or add a dash of hot sauce for extra kick. This was comfort food born from necessity, where every bite carried the taste of ingenuity and the resourcefulness that made a little go a long way. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes were the kind of rustic comfort food that required no fancy tools, just a warm hearth. Whole sweet potatoes, unpeeled, were nestled into the hot ashes of a wood-burning fireplace or stove where the heat baked them slowly from the inside out. As they cooked, their natural sugars caramelized, giving them a deep, honey-like sweetness. Once tender, they were pulled from the ashes, brushed clean, split open, and eaten steaming hot, sometimes with a pat of butter or sprinkle of salt. The method required patience but no special ingredients, making it perfect for families with limited resources. During the Civil Rights era, when electricity and modern ovens were not always available in rural areas, this technique kept a connection to older traditions. Sweet potatoes roasted this way were often eaten as a snack on cold days, their warmth and sweetness offering simple comfort. It was proof that good food did not need gadgets, just fire, patience, and a little time. Beaten biscuits with country ham were a labor of love both in preparation and flavor. The biscuit dough was made with flour, lard, and water, then pounded, sometimes hundreds of strokes, with a rolling pin or mallet until perfectly smooth. This beating gave the biscuits their dense, cracker-like texture. Once baked, they were split open and filled with thin slices of salty, cured country ham, creating a sharp contrast between the savory meat and the plain biscuit. These sandwiches were popular for church gatherings, community meetings, and packed lunches, as they traveled well without spoiling quickly. During the Civil Rights era, The ham was often sliced paper-thin to make it stretch, especially when feeding large families or guests. The preparation of beaten biscuits was often a group effort, with family members taking turns at the pounding, turning the process into both work and tradition. The result was a humble but memorable bite that carried the taste of Southern kitchens and the persistence of those who kept these methods alive. Cane syrup popcorn balls were a sticky, sweet treat that brought excitement to holidays, school fairs, and church socials. Popcorn was popped fresh and tossed in a hot syrup made from cane syrup, butter, and sometimes a hint of vanilla. While still warm, the mixture was shaped by hand into tight, round balls, the syrup cooling to hold everything together. The rich, earthy sweetness of cane syrup gave the popcorn a flavor far deeper than plain sugar. These treats were often wrapped in wax paper and handed out during special occasions, making them feel like a gift. During the Civil Rights era, cane syrup popcorn balls were a way to make something festive without expensive ingredients. They could be made in large batches, feeding many with just a few pantry staples. For children, they were a highlight of community gatherings, while for adults, they were a reminder of simpler times. The making of them often filled kitchens with laughter, sticky fingers, and the smell of caramelized sugar. Field pea salad with onion and vinegar was a chilled dish that made the most of leftover peas from supper. The peas were drained, cooled, and tossed with chopped onions, a splash of vinegar, and a touch of oil or bacon drippings for richness. The result was tangy, refreshing, and hearty enough to be served as a side dish alongside fried chicken, pork chops, or fish. This salad was perfect for hot days, when a stove-heavy meal felt too heavy, providing a cool contrast to the main course. During the Civil Rights era, this was a practical recipe because it used ingredients already on hand and required no extra cooking. Vinegar acted as a preservative, meaning the salad could be made in the morning and kept for later without spoiling. It was common at church picnics and community potlucks, where big bowls of it would sit alongside other homemade dishes. For many, the flavor was tied to summer's peak, when gardens and fields overflowed with fresh peas. Rabbit stew with vegetables was the kind of slow-cooked meal that stretched scarce resources into something deeply satisfying. Rabbit, whether hunted or raised, was browned in a pot and then simmered for hours with onions, carrots, potatoes, and whatever other vegetables were available. The slow cooking made the meat tender and infused the broth with a rich, gamey flavor. During the Civil Rights era, rabbit was a practical choice for many rural African American families because it could be sourced locally and did not require store-bought meat. This stew was often thickened with flour or cornmeal to make it heartier, ensuring every bowl was filling. It was served with cornbread or biscuits to soak up the savory broth, turning the meal into something that could feed a family from just a few ingredients. Beyond its practicality, rabbit stew was tied to tradition, often made from recipes passed down through generations. It was a dish that spoke of resilience, adaptability, and the ability to make the most of what was at hand. Cornmeal dumplings in collared potlikker were a clever way to turn leftover cooking liquid into a meal. Potlikker, the nutrient-rich broth left from boiling collard greens, was saved and reheated, often fortified with bits of ham or pork fat for extra flavor. Cornmeal dumplings, made from a simple mixture of cornmeal, flour, and water, were dropped into the simmering potlikker and cooked until tender. The dumplings absorbed the smoky, savory flavors of the broth, making them both hearty and nourishing. During the Civil Rights era, nothing from the kitchen was wasted, and this dish was a prime example of that mindset. Collared potlikker was already rich in vitamins and minerals, so turning it into a full meal was both practical and healthful. This dish was often served at midday, providing energy for the rest of the day's work. For many, it carried the taste of home gardens, shared labor, and the comfort of knowing that even scraps could be transformed into something worth savoring. Hominy grits with red-eye gravy was a breakfast or supper dish that combined creamy grits with a bold, coffee-infused sauce. Grits made from ground hominy were cooked until soft and buttery, then topped with a gravy made by deglazing a skillet of fried country ham with strong black coffee. The result was a savory, slightly bitter sauce that cut through the richness of the grits. During the Civil Rights era, This dish was valued for its ability to be made from inexpensive pantry staples while still feeling indulgent. Grits provided warmth and sustenance, while the gravy made use of every bit of flavor from the ham. Red-eye gravy was especially popular in rural areas where coffee was a morning staple and nothing from a meal went to waste. The pairing of smooth grits and bold gravy was deeply satisfying, making it a favorite in both home kitchens and small-town diners. Boiled saltfish with onions was a practical and flavorful way to prepare preserved seafood. Salt-cured fish was soaked overnight to draw out excess salt, then boiled until tender. Sliced onions were often added to the pot or sautéed separately in a bit of oil or pork fat, then spooned over the fish for extra flavor. During the Civil Rights era, saltfish was a reliable source of protein that could be stored without refrigeration, making it important for households without modern appliances. It was often served with boiled potatoes, cornbread, or rice to make the meal more filling. The flavor was strong and distinct, appealing to those who had grown up with it as a staple. In many families, boiled saltfish was tied to older traditions and passed down recipes, making it more than just a convenient meal. It was a link to past generations and the resourcefulness they lived by. Pumpkin and sweet potato mash was a creamy, spiced side dish that made the most of autumn harvests. Pumpkin and sweet potatoes were peeled, boiled, and mashed together until smooth, then seasoned with cinnamon, nutmeg, and a touch of sweetener, often molasses or sorghum. The combination created a naturally sweet, earthy flavor that paired well with roasted meats or fried chicken. During the Civil Rights era, this dish was popular because it relied on inexpensive homegrown produce and could be made in large batches for gatherings. It was a way to add both color and comfort to the table, and it often made an appearance during holiday meals. Some families enriched it with milk or butter when they could afford it, while others kept it simple and rustic. Either way, it was a dish that celebrated the flavors of the season and the practicality of using every bit of the harvest before it spoiled. Cold watermelon. Rind soup was a way to ensure nothing from a summer melon went to waste, turning the usually discarded rind into a refreshing dish. The pale green flesh was peeled, chopped, and simmered with sugar or sorghum until tender, then pureed and chilled for serving. Sometimes a bit of lemon juice or mint was added for brightness, making it a light, cooling soup that worked well on hot days. It was an inventive solution born from resourcefulness, where the sweetened rind provided a subtle flavor that was both unique and satisfying. While not everyone embraced the idea of eating watermelon rinds, those who did often remembered it fondly as a taste of summer thrift. In communities where every part of the harvest had to be used, this dish was a testament to creativity and survival during hard times. Served in small bowls, it was a gentle, sweet end to a meal built from humble means. Oyster and cornbread stuffing was a prized holiday dish, making use of oysters when they were still affordable and easy to get in coastal areas or through fishmongers who traveled inland. Cornbread crumbs were mixed with sautéed onions, celery, and seasonings before being enriched with briny oysters and their liquor. The mixture was baked until golden and fragrant, delivering a rich, savory side that balanced the sweetness of cornbread with the deep ocean flavor of the shellfish. While oysters might seem like a luxury today, they were once a common ingredient in Southern cooking, even for families on a modest budget. During the Civil Rights era, this dish often appeared at Christmas or Sunday dinners, a reminder of better times and the shared joy of special gatherings. Families treasured the recipe, often passing it down through generations, but as oyster prices rose, it became a rare indulgence rather than a seasonal staple. Vegetable chow. Chow relish brought color and zest to meals when fresh produce was scarce in winter. This tangy condiment was made by chopping garden vegetables like green tomatoes, cabbage, peppers, and onions, then cooking them in vinegar with mustard seeds, celery seeds, and sugar until tender. The result was a sweet and sour relish that could be spooned over beans, greens, or cornbread to liven up a simple meal. Families often made large batches in late summer, canning jars to last through the cold months. It was not just about flavor. It was about extending the harvest and ensuring something bright was on the table no matter the season. Chow-chow could turn a pot of plain pinto beans into a meal that felt complete, and its vibrant taste cut through the richness of pork-heavy dishes. In many homes, it was the taste of resourcefulness, community gardens, and the tradition of preserving food to carry the family through leaner times. Peanut soup with sweet potatoes was a hearty, comforting bowl that combined the earthiness of ground peanuts with the natural sweetness of slow-cooked sweet potatoes. This recipe had deep roots in African culinary traditions, carried into the American South by enslaved people and adapted with local ingredients. The peanuts were ground or mashed into a paste and simmered with onions, spices, and chunks of sweet potato until everything melded into a thick, creamy texture. It was both filling and affordable, using inexpensive ingredients that could feed a family. During the Civil Rights era, this soup was a practical choice. It provided protein, carbohydrates, and comfort in one pot. Families often seasoned it differently depending on what they had on hand, from smoky paprika to fresh greens stirred in at the end. Served with cornbread, it made a meal that warmed the body and soul, reminding those who ate it of heritage, resilience, and the ability to create abundance from the simplest pantry. Dandelion greens with vinegar turned a foraged plant into a treasured side dish, especially in early spring when gardens had little else to offer. The young greens were gathered from fields or yards, washed thoroughly, and boiled or sautéed with a bit of pork fat or butter until tender. A splash of vinegar just before serving brightened their slightly bitter flavor, making them both refreshing and nourishing. This was the kind of dish that cost nothing but time and knowledge, relying on a connection to the land and an understanding of edible plants. For many African American families, foraging was not just a pastime. It was a necessity that tied them to older generations who had survived by knowing how to work with what nature offered. These greens brought vitamins and variety to diets that might otherwise be heavy in starches and preserved foods. They were proof that even in the leanest months, the earth still offered sustenance to those who knew where to look. Apple stack cake with sorghum syrup was a labor of love that turned simple ingredients into something extraordinary. Thin layers of cake, often made from a spiced batter, were stacked with a filling of stewed apples cooked down with sorghum syrup until thick and flavorful. As the cake sat, the layers softened, melding into a tender, almost pudding-like texture that was rich, yet not overly sweet. This was a special occasion dessert, often baked for weddings, church gatherings, or major holidays, where the act of making it was just as important as eating it. Sorghum syrup added a deep, almost smoky sweetness that reflected the agricultural roots of the community, especially in areas where cane sugar was expensive. During the Civil Rights era, families might save their best ingredients for this cake, knowing it would bring people together at the table. It stood as a reminder that celebration could still be found, even in challenging times, through shared traditions and careful handiwork. Cabbage and potato hash was a reliable dish that could stretch small amounts of food into something hearty enough to feed everyone. Chopped cabbage and diced potatoes were sautéed in a skillet with onions and a bit of fat, often leftover drippings from cooking meat, until browned and tender. Seasonings varied depending on what was available, but salt, pepper, and a dash of vinegar were common. This was the kind of meal that could be served alone or alongside a small piece of meat, making it adaptable for lean times. During the Civil Rights era, when many families were working with limited means, a skillet of cabbage and potato hash could provide warmth and satisfaction without requiring expensive ingredients. It was also a smart way to use vegetables that stored well through winter, ensuring nothing went to waste. The simplicity of the dish belied its importance. It kept bellies full and spirits steady, showing that comfort could be found in the most unassuming combinations. Fried cornmeal. Mush was a way to give new life to leftover cooked cornmeal, a staple in many homes. Once the mush cooled and firmed, it was sliced into thick pieces and fried in a skillet until the edges turned crisp and golden. The inside stayed soft and creamy, creating a pleasing contrast in textures. It could be served with syrup for breakfast, with gravy for supper, or even as a plain snack during the day. In the Civil Rights era, this was a practical and frugal habit, never letting food go to waste, and always finding a way to make it enjoyable again. The dish carried with it the warmth of family kitchens and the smell of frying cornmeal that signaled a meal was on its way. Even though it was made from the humblest ingredients, fried cornmeal mush was proof that skill and tradition could turn leftovers into something that felt entirely new. Beni seed candy was a sweet reminder of African heritage, made by toasting sesame seeds, called beni seeds in the South, and binding them together with caramelized sugar or honey. This brittle-like treat was crisp, nutty, and deeply fragrant, often made in small batches for holidays or church events. Beni seeds were brought to America by enslaved Africans, and recipes using them endured as a quiet act of cultural preservation. Making the candy required patience, as the sugar had to be cooked to just the right stage before the seeds were stirred in, and the mixture was quickly spread and cut. For families during the Civil Rights era, this candy was a special indulgence that also carried history in every bite. Sharing it was more than sharing food. It was sharing a story, a connection to ancestors, and a piece of heritage that had survived through generations. Even as other sweets became more common, Beni seed candy remained a cherished link to the past. Homemade buttermilk cheese was a fresh, simple cheese that required only soured milk, heat, and a bit of salt. The milk was gently warmed until curds formed, then strained through cloth to remove the whey. The curds could be eaten plain, mixed with herbs, or spread over bread and cornbread. This was an old-fashioned way to ensure nothing went to waste when milk began to turn, and it provided a source of protein without needing expensive ingredients. During the Civil Rights era, when store-bought cheese was a luxury for many, making it at home was both economical and satisfying. The process was often passed down in families, with children watching and learning so they could carry the skill forward. The flavor was mild but fresh, a reminder that even the most basic foods could be nourishing and enjoyable when treated with care. It was a quiet, everyday example of self-sufficiency in action. Share your favorite old-time recipe in the comments like this video and subscribe for more rich slices of history.